The Chevrolet Monte Carlo has one of the strangest identity arcs in American car history. It started life as a long-hooded, V8-powered personal luxury coupe that looked like it belonged outside a country club, but could embarrass muscle cars at a stoplight. Then, somewhere along the way, it became something else entirely. A front-wheel drive two-door, a rental lot regular, the kind of car you'd expect to see driven carefully to the grocery store with the turn signal on a little too early. And yet, this same car once dominated NASCAR. Not briefly, not accidentally. It became one of the most successful stock cars of its era, winning races, championships, and earning a reputation as a high-speed weapon on America's fastest ovals. So how does a NASCAR legend turn into a so-called grandma car? To understand that transformation, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, when Chevrolet built the Monte Carlo with a very specific idea in mind. The Monte Carlo debuted in September of 1969, right at the height of America's muscle car obsession. But Chevrolet wasn't trying to build just another Chevelle. Instead, this was marketed as something new for the brand, Chevrolet's first personal luxury car. The name alone was meant to say everything. Monte Carlo, borrowed straight from the city in Monaco, a place associated with grand touring cars, wealth, and European style, not drag strips and burnout contests. Under the skin, though, this thing was pure Detroit. The first-generation Monte Carlo rode on a stretched Chevelle A-body platform, giving it a massive hood, a short rear deck, and that unmistakable Coke bottle profile that defined early 1970s American design. It was wide, it was low, and it looked expensive. Details mattered here. Hidden windshield wipers, a formal roofline, and, up front, a distinctive grille wearing a Knight's Crest emblem. A subtle signal that this car was supposed to feel more refined than your average muscle machine. But refinement didn't mean slow. Early Monte Carlos were offered exclusively with V8 power, and if you knew what box to check, you could turn this luxury coupe into something genuinely nasty. The SS454 package, offered from 1970 to 1971, stuffed a 7.4-liter big block V8 under that endless hood. On paper, Chevrolet rated it at around 360 to 365 horsepower. In reality, it was enough to make the Monte Carlo one of the quickest luxury cars on the road, a machine that blended straight-line muscle with a quieter, more upscale personality. This was the Monte Carlo at its most conflicted, and arguably its most interesting. Because, even in its earliest form, it was already straddling two worlds, performance and comfort. And that balancing act would define its future in ways no one could have predicted. But the real turning point for the Monte Carlo didn't come from performance numbers. It came from a changing world. And that world was about to hit the entire auto industry hard. By the early 1970s, the world that gave birth to big block luxury coupes was starting to disappear. Emissions regulations were tightening, insurance companies were cracking down, and the oil crisis was looming on the horizon. Chevrolet knew the Monte Carlo couldn't stay exactly the same. For 1973, the car entered its second generation, adopting what General Motors called the colonnade body style. Everything about the Monte Carlo grew larger and more rounded. The lines softened, the proportions stretched, and the design leaned even harder into comfort and presence rather than outright aggression. One of the most recognizable features of this era was the frameless door glass paired with fixed rear opera windows. A styling cue meant to emphasize luxury and elegance, even as performance quietly took a step back. Ironically, this softer, more refined Monte Carlo was a massive success. In fact, Motor Trend named it Car of the Year in 1973. Buyers loved it. They weren't chasing quarter-mile times anymore. They wanted something that looked upscale, rode smoothly, and still had enough V8 under the hood to feel powerful without being unruly. Big block engines, including the 454, were still available early in this generation, but the writing was on the wall. Horsepower numbers dropped year after year as emissions equipment piled on and compression ratios fell. By the mid to late 1970s, the Monte Carlo was no longer that quiet muscle car it once was. It had become exactly what Chevrolet intended: a comfortable, stylish, personal luxury coupe that prioritized cruising over competition. And yet, beneath all that plushness, the Monte Carlo still had something most people overlooked. It had the right proportions, the right balance, and, as it would soon turn out, the right bones. Because just as the Monte Carlo was becoming softer on the streets, it was about to become something entirely different on the racetrack. But first, it had to get smaller. By the late 1970s, the American auto industry was in full retreat. The oil crisis had reshaped buyer priorities. Fuel economy mattered. Weight mattered. And massive land yachts were suddenly a liability instead of a selling point. So, for 1978, Chevrolet did something unthinkable just a few years earlier. They shrank the Monte Carlo. The third-generation Monte Carlo was 15 inches shorter and nearly 800 pounds lighter than the car it replaced. On paper, this sounded like the final nail in the coffin for a nameplate that once carried a 454 big block. And in some ways, it was. For the first time, a V6 engine became the standard power plant in a Monte Carlo. This was no longer a car built around excess. It was built around efficiency. But here's the part most people forget. That massive weight loss fundamentally changed the way the Monte Carlo behaved. The downsized chassis made the car tighter, more balanced, and easier to control. Traits that mattered far more on a racetrack than raw horsepower ever did. Chevrolet even experimented a little. In 1980, a rare turbocharged V6 option briefly appeared. Hinting that performance hadn't been completely abandoned, it was just being rethought. At the time, few people noticed. To most buyers, this Monte Carlo was simply a sensible, stylish coupe for an era that demanded restraint. But in hindsight, this downsizing move accidentally set the stage for something huge. Because, while street performance was fading, the Monte Carlo was becoming nearly perfect for a very specific kind of racing. One where aerodynamics, balance, and durability mattered more than big block bragging rights. And that kind of racing was NASCAR. In 1981, the Monte Carlo entered what would become the most important chapter in its entire history. The fourth generation arrived with a sharper, more angular design, and for the first time, the car looked like it was shaped by the wind instead of fighting it. Flat surfaces, a low nose, clean lines. On the street, it was just another mid-size American coupe trying to survive a changing market. But on the racetrack, it was something else entirely. NASCAR teams quickly realized that this Monte Carlo had a massive advantage. Its body shape cut through the air better than most of its competitors, and its proportions made it easier to set up for high-speed oval racing. Before long, the Monte Carlo became the car to beat in NASCAR. Race after race, season after season, it dominated, and Chevrolet leaned into it. In 1983, after a 12-year absence, the Monte Carlo SS returned. This wasn't a throwback for nostalgia's sake. The SS featured a more aggressive aerodynamic front fascia, a rear spoiler, and a high-output 305 cubic inch V8 that gave the street car a direct visual connection to what fans were seeing on Sundays. But the most extreme version came in 1986, the Monte Carlo Aero Coupe. Built purely for homologation, the Aero Coupe featured a radically sloped rear window designed to reduce aerodynamic drag at high speeds. It looked strange, almost unfinished, and that was exactly the point. Chevrolet needed this shape approved for racing, and once it was, the Monte Carlo's dominance only grew stronger. By the mid-1980s, the Monte Carlo wasn't just competitive in NASCAR, it was legendary. Championships, iconic liveries, household name drivers. This car had gone from personal luxury coupe to stock car icon, and it did it without ever being a supercar or a technological marvel. It was simply the right car at the right time. But while the Monte Carlo was building its legend at 200 miles per hour, something very different was happening back at the dealership. And that's where the identity crisis truly began. By the late 1980s, the Monte Carlo's time at the top was coming to an end. Aerodynamics were evolving, NASCAR regulations were changing, and buyer tastes on the streets had shifted again. After 1988, Chevrolet quietly pulled the plug. The Monte Carlo disappeared. For 6 years, the nameplate was gone, replaced in Chevrolet showrooms by the Lumina, a front-wheel drive sedan that represented everything the old Monte Carlo wasn't. When the Monte Carlo finally returned in 1995, it came back different. Very different. The fifth-generation Monte Carlo was now front-wheel drive. It was built on the same platform as the Lumina sedan, and, while it still bore a coupe body, the spirit of the original car was largely gone. This version of the Monte Carlo wasn't chasing NASCAR glory or personal luxury prestige. It was chasing mainstream buyers. Under the hood, V8s were nowhere to be found. Instead, you got V6 engines, including the sportier Z34 trim, which used a 3.4-liter dual overhead cam V6 before later switching to a 3.8-liter pushrod unit. On paper, it wasn't slow, but emotionally, it was disconnected from everything the Monte Carlo name once stood for. This was the moment the transformation became complete. The Monte Carlo that once wore SS badges and dominated superspeedways was now a comfortable front-wheel drive coupe aimed squarely at daily commuting. This is where the grandma car reputation started to stick. And yet, Chevrolet still wasn't ready to fully let go of the Monte Carlo's racing heritage, because one last attempt at redemption was coming. In 2000, Chevrolet introduced the sixth and final generation of the Monte Carlo. This was the car that would close the chapter on nearly 4 decades of ups, downs, and unexpected evolution. The styling was more rounded than its angular predecessors, borrowing subtle cues from the original personal luxury Monte Carlos, a nod to its heritage, but it was also unmistakably a product of the new millennium. Under the hood, Chevrolet briefly flirted with V8 performance again. The SS Supercharged, offered in 2004 and 2005, used a 3.8-liter V6 with forced induction. Then, in its final 2 years, 2006 and 2007, the Monte Carlo returned to V8 power with a 5.3-liter LS4 engine, the first V8 in a Monte Carlo in nearly 20 years. It was powerful, sure, but by then, the Monte Carlo's image had changed completely. The sleek NASCAR hero of the 1980s had become a soft, luxury-focused, front-wheel drive coupe for suburban America. To honor its past, Chevrolet released special NASCAR-themed signature editions, paying tribute to legends like Dale Earnhardt and Jeff Gordon. But for most buyers, these were cosmetic nods. The Monte Carlo's racing heart had been long buried. By 2007, sales had declined, and Chevrolet quietly discontinued the model. What began as a personal luxury muscle coupe and rose to NASCAR dominance ended as a comfortable, everyday car, a grandma car in the eyes of most. And yet, for enthusiasts who remember its heyday, the Monte Carlo will always be more than that. It's a story of extremes, a car that could go from cruising the country club to tearing up Daytona. A car that proves identity in the automotive world is never fixed, and that, sometimes, even legends have to evolve, or fade quietly into history. Tell us in the comments, which generation of the Monte Carlo would you want to drive and why? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Monte Carlo's strange and fascinating story, make sure to drop a like, share it with fellow car enthusiasts, and subscribe to the channel for more documentary-style videos on the rarest and most iconic cars in history. Until next time, enthusiasts.